Mother Bear learned to operate medical equipment to save human baby. Everyone was speechless. The wind started as a whisper that morning, barely rustling the pine needles outside Ethan Marshall's cabin. He stood at the kitchen window, holding his 6-month-old daughter Lily against his chest, watching the first snowflakes drift down like lost feathers. The weather report had mentioned a storm, but out here in the wilderness of northern Montana, storms came and went like passing thoughts. Ethan had lived through dozens of them in the 3 years since he'd moved to this remote research station, but something felt different about this one. The air had a weight to it, a thickness that pressed against the windows and made the old wood beams creak in ways they usually didn't. Lily gurgled softly in his arms, her tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, and he bounced her gently, humming a tune his own mother used to sing. The cabin was warm, filled with the smell of coffee and the cedar logs burning in the fireplace, creating a bubble of comfort against the growing cold outside. Ethan had chosen this life deliberately, trading his position at the university for solitude and research in the wild. After his wife, Jessica, had passed during childbirth, the city had felt like a cage made of memories. Every street corner, every coffee shop, every park bench held her ghost. Out here, surrounded by nothing but forest and sky, he could breathe again. He could raise Lily the way Jessica would have wanted, close to nature, away from the noise and rush of modern life. His work, studying wildlife behavior patterns, could be done remotely, sending reports and data back to the university through satellite internet when the weather allowed. The isolation that would drive most people mad had become his salvation. Lily had never known anything else, and watching her eyes light up at the sight of deer passing by their window or eagles soaring overhead made every sacrifice worth it. The storm built slowly throughout the morning, the snow falling heavier with each passing hour. By noon, the world outside had transformed into a swirling, white void. The satellite dish on the roof groaned under the weight of accumulating snow, and the internet connection flickered and died. The phone lines had gone down an hour earlier. Ethan wasn't worried yet. He had a generator, plenty of supplies, and had weathered worse storms than this. But Lily had been fussy all morning, which was unusual for her. She was normally such a happy baby, content to play with her wooden blocks or watch the mobile of forest animals spinning above her crib. Today, she kept crying and pulling at her ears, refusing her bottle, her little face flushed with what looked like the beginning of a fever. He took her temperature. 101 degrees. Not dangerous yet, but worth watching. He gave her infant acetaminophen and tried to get her to drink some water, but she turned her head away, whimpering. The sound cut through him like a knife. Every parent knew that particular helplessness, watching their child suffer and being unable to instantly fix it. He walked her around the cabin, singing softly, pointing out the pictures on the walls, photos he'd taken of the local wildlife. There was the family of foxes that denned near the creek, the golden eagle that nested in the tall pine, the black bear mother with her 2 cubs that he'd photographed last spring. Lily usually loved looking at the animals, but today her eyes were glassy, unfocused. As the afternoon wore on, the storm intensified into something Ethan had rarely seen. The wind howled like a living thing, throwing snow against the window so hard it sounded like sand. The visibility dropped to 0. Even the massive pine trees just 20 feet from the cabin disappeared into the white. The generator hummed steadily in the shed, keeping the lights on and the heating system running, but Ethan could hear it straining against the wind. He checked his emergency supplies again. 5 gallons of extra fuel for the generator, enough food for 2 weeks, medical supplies including antibiotics he'd convinced a doctor friend to prescribe just in case. He'd always been cautious, but with Lily depending on him, he'd become almost obsessive about preparation. That's when he first saw her. just a shadow at first, barely visible through the storm. He was standing at the living room window, Lily finally sleeping fitfully in his arms, when something large moved at the edge of the tree line. He squinted, trying to make out the shape through the driving snow. Then, for just a moment, the wind died down, creating a pocket of clarity, and he saw her clearly. A massive grizzly bear, her brown fur covered in snow, standing perfectly still, facing the cabin. She wasn't moving toward them or away, just standing there, watching. Ethan's heart rate spiked. Bears should be hibernating by now, deep in their dens, sleeping through the winter. To see one out in a storm like this was beyond unusual. It was wrong. He watched her for several minutes, neither of them moving. There was something unsettling about her stillness, her focus. Bears didn't behave like this. They avoided human habitation, especially in weather like this. They certainly didn't stand and stare at houses. Then, as suddenly as she'd appeared, she turned and vanished back into the storm. Ethan told himself it was nothing. Just a bear confused by the weather, maybe looking for last-minute food before settling in for winter. But something about her presence lingered in his mind. A nagging feeling he couldn't shake. Lily's fever climbed through the evening. 102. 103. The acetaminophen wasn't bringing it down anymore. She'd stopped crying, which somehow was worse than the crying had been. She lay limply in his arms, her breathing shallow and quick. Ethan tried everything he knew. Cool washcloths on her forehead, trying to get her to drink electrolyte solution. Even a lukewarm bath that made her shiver but didn't break the fever. He kept checking his medical guide, the thick wilderness first aid manual he'd memorized cover to cover. High fever in infants could be dangerous, could lead to seizures, could be a sign of serious infection. The book recommended seeking immediate medical attention for any fever over 103 in a baby under 1 year old. But there was no medical attention to seek. The nearest hospital was 60 miles away on a good day. In this storm, the roads would be impassable. Even if he could somehow get to his truck, buried now under 3 feet of snow, he'd never make it a mile before getting stuck. The radio crackled with static when he tried to call for help. The emergency services frequency was dead air. He was completely, utterly alone with a sick baby and no way to get help. The weight of that reality settled on his shoulders like a physical thing. Every decision, every action or inaction was his alone. Lily's life was entirely in his hands. He set up a makeshift medical station in the living room, moving her crib next to the fireplace for warmth, arranging all his medical supplies on the coffee table. He had a pulse oximeter, a gift from a paranoid relative that he'd rolled his eyes at receiving, but now blessed them for sending. Lily's oxygen levels were okay, hovering around 95%. Not great, but not immediately dangerous. He had antibiotics, but giving them without knowing what was wrong could do more harm than good. He had an IV kit, something he'd learned to use during his wilderness first responder training, but the thought of trying to find a vein in his baby's tiny arm made his hands shake. The bear returned at midnight. Ethan was sitting in the rocking chair, Lily against his chest, when he saw the shadow again through the window. This time she came closer, close enough that he could see her eyes reflecting the light from the window. She sat down in the snow, maybe 30 feet from the cabin, and just watched. Her presence should have terrified him. A grizzly bear that close to the cabin, behaving so strangely, was a serious threat. But something about her demeanor, the way she sat so calmly, so purposefully, made him feel oddly comforted. It was like she was keeping vigil with him. Another parent watching through the long night. He talked to her through the window, his voice low to not disturb Lily. He told her about his daughter, about the fever that wouldn't break, about his fear that grew with each passing hour. The bear didn't move, just sat there in the snow, occasionally shaking the accumulation off her massive head. He knew he was being irrational, talking to a wild animal like it could understand, but the isolation and fear were making him a little crazy. Or maybe not crazy, maybe just desperate for any kind of connection, any sense that he wasn't facing this alone. Lily's breathing became more labored around 2 in the morning. The little wheeze that accompanied each breath sent spikes of panic through Ethan's chest. He checked her oxygen levels again. 92%. Dropping. He tried to remember everything he'd learned about respiratory distress in infants. Keep them upright, monitor continuously, be ready to perform CPR if necessary. The thought of having to perform CPR on his daughter made him want to vomit. He'd practiced on dolls during his training, but this was Lily, so small, so fragile. Her entire chest was smaller than his hand. The bear stood up suddenly, making Ethan jump. But instead of leaving, she moved closer to the cabin, close enough that he could see the snow melting on her nose, see the way her breath fogged in the cold air. She pressed her nose against the window, leaving a wet mark on the glass, and for a moment their eyes met. There was something in her gaze, an intelligence, an awareness that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Bears were smart. He knew that from his research, but this was different. This was like looking into the eyes of something that understood, that recognized his distress. She pulled back from the window and began to pace, back and forth in front of the cabin, her massive paws leaving deep tracks in the snow. Her behavior was so unusual that for a moment, Ethan forgot about his fear, caught up in the mystery of it. Why was she here? What did she want? Bears didn't act like this. In all his years of studying wildlife, he'd never seen or heard of anything like it. She seemed agitated now, stopping occasionally to look at the window, then resuming her pacing. It was like she was trying to communicate something, but he couldn't understand what. Lily's fever hit 104 degrees at 3:30 in the morning. Her little body was burning up, her skin hot and dry to the touch. The seizure came without warning. One moment she was lying still in his arms, the next her entire body went rigid, her back arching, her eyes rolling back. Ethan laid her on the couch, turning her on her side, timing the seizure with his watch. 30 seconds, 45, a minute, the longest minute of his life. When it finally stopped, she lay there limp, barely responsive. Her oxygen levels had dropped to 90%. He made the decision then. He had to do something more than just wait and hope. He prepared the IV kit with shaking hands, found the tiny vein in her arm after 3 attempts that left him sweating, despite the cold. He started a saline drip to keep her hydrated and gave her a dose of antibiotics, praying he was making the right choice. He set up the portable oxygen concentrator he'd bought for emergencies, fitting the tiny mask over her face. It was designed for adults, too big for her, but he made it work with medical tape and desperation. The bear had stopped pacing. She sat directly in front of the window now, so close that her breath fogged the glass. Ethan found himself looking at her as he worked, drawing some kind of strange strength from her presence. He'd read about animals sensing human distress, about the inexplicable bonds that sometimes formed between species. But this felt like more than that. It felt like she was there for a reason, though he couldn't imagine what that reason could be. The oxygen concentrator hummed steadily, pushing air into Lily's lungs. Her levels climbed slowly back to 94%. The 4th dripped steadily, keeping her hydrated. The antibiotics were in her system now, fighting whatever infection was raging through her small body. Ethan had done everything he could do. Now, all he could do was wait and watch and pray to whatever forces governed the universe that it would be enough. The storm raged on outside, showing no signs of letting up. The generator coughed occasionally, struggling against the wind but kept running. The bear remained at her post, occasionally standing to shake off the snow, then settling back down. Ethan talked to her periodically, updating her on Lily's condition, aware of how insane he would sound if anyone could hear him. But there was no one to hear, just him and his daughter and a grizzly bear keeping watch in a blizzard. Dawn came slowly, the darkness outside gradually lightening to a dim gray. The storm had lessened slightly, but snow still fell heavily, and the wind still howled through the trees. Lily's fever had stabilized at 102, still high, but better than it had been. Her breathing was easier with the oxygen support. The antibiotics needed time to work, he told himself. She just needed time. The bear stood as the light grew stronger, and for a moment Ethan thought she was going to leave, but instead she moved around the side of the cabin, out of sight. He could hear her moving through the snow, the heavy footfalls distinctive even over the wind. Then he heard something else, a sound that made no sense. A metallic clinking, like something being moved or adjusted. He wanted to go look, but he couldn't leave Lily, couldn't risk moving her from the oxygen. The sound continued for several minutes, then stopped. The bear reappeared at the front window, sat back down in her spot. She looked different somehow, though Ethan couldn't say exactly how. Maybe it was his exhaustion, the way lack of sleep was making everything seem surreal and dreamlike. He checked Lily's vitals again. Oxygen at 95%, fever at 101.5. Small improvements, but improvements nonetheless. He must have dozed off in the chair, because suddenly he jerked awake to find the room darker. How long had he been asleep? He checked his watch. Only 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Lily was still breathing steadily under the oxygen mask. The fourth bag was nearly empty. He prepared another one, checking her arm for any signs of infiltration or infection at the IV site. Everything looked good. As good as could be expected anyway. The bear was gone. The spot where she'd been sitting was just an impression in the snow, already being filled in by the continuing snowfall. Ethan felt an unexpected pang of loss. As strange as it had been, her presence had been oddly comforting. He was truly alone now with his sick daughter in the storm. He checked the generator gauge. Still half a tank of fuel, enough for another day at least. The oxygen concentrator had plenty of battery backup. They could make it through another night if they had to. But as the day wore on, Ethan began to worry about a different problem. The oxygen concentrator was making a strange noise, a grinding sound that hadn't been there before. He checked all the connections, made sure the filters were clean, but the noise continued. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Not just the noise, but the machine itself. The power light went out. The steady hum of the compressor died. Lily's oxygen support was gone. He tried everything. Checked the power connection, checked the battery, even took the machine apart as much as he dared. Something internal had failed. Some crucial component had given out. He had a backup oxygen tank, but it was small, maybe 2 hours of oxygen at most. After that, Lily would be on her own, and her oxygen levels had already shown they couldn't maintain without support. The panic that rose in his chest was like a living thing, clawing at his throat. That's when he heard it again. The metallic clinking sound from outside. He looked out the window and saw the bear was back, but she wasn't at the window. She was near the shed where he kept his emergency supplies and equipment. She was doing something, moving something with her paws and nose, but he couldn't see what from this angle. The rational part of his brain told him to ignore it, to focus on Lily, but something made him keep watching. The bear moved with purpose, not randomly exploring, but seeming to work at something specific. Then she stopped, looked directly at the window where Ethan was watching, and made a sound. Not a roar or a growl, but a soft chuffing noise, almost like she was calling to him. She did it again, then moved away from the shed, back toward her spot by the window. As she moved, Ethan saw what she'd been working on. The backup generator for the medical equipment, the one he'd forgotten he even had, was sitting outside the shed, cleared of snow. It was impossible. Bears didn't do things like that. They didn't understand human technology, didn't make connections between machines and their purposes. But there it was, the backup generator he'd bought months ago and never set up, sitting in the snow where the bear had uncovered it. He looked at the bear, now sitting in her usual spot, watching him through the window. She chuffed again, softer this time, and he could have sworn she nodded her massive head toward the generator. His hands were shaking as he bundled up in his winter gear. He had to leave Lily for just a few minutes, had to get that generator running. He kissed her burning forehead, whispered that he'd be right back, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. The bear didn't move as he passed within 10 feet of her, just watched him with those intelligent eyes. He dragged the generator to the cabin's auxiliary power input, connected it with numb fingers, added fuel from his emergency supply. It started on the third pull. The power flowed, and inside, he heard the oxygen concentrator spring back to life. He looked at the bear, standing now, and said thank you. The words were swallowed by the wind, but she seemed to hear them anyway. She chuffed once more, then turned and walked back toward the tree line. But she didn't go far, just to the edge of the clearing, where she lay down in the snow, still watching, still keeping vigil. Back inside, Ethan checked Lily immediately. The oxygen was flowing again, her levels climbing back to 95%. Her fever was down to 100 degrees. The antibiotics were working. She was going to be okay. He knew it with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than logic. He looked out at the bear, barely visible now through the falling snow, and felt a connection he couldn't explain, a gratitude that went beyond words. The storm continued through the night, but Ethan no longer felt alone. He dozed in the chair, waking periodically to check on Lily, to add fuel to the generator, to look for the bear. She was always there, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always watching. By morning, Lily's fever had broken completely. She woke hungry, crying for her bottle, and Ethan cried with relief as he prepared it. The storm was beginning to break up, patches of blue sky visible between the clouds. Chapter 2. The Watcher's Intent. The bear remained at the edge of the clearing as the storm finally passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Ethan watched her through the window as he fed Lily her bottle, the baby's appetite returning with encouraging strength. The bear seemed different in the daylight, less mysterious but no less remarkable. He could see the gray in her muzzle, the scars on her shoulder that spoke of years surviving in the wilderness. She was an old bear, a mother many times over, he guessed. That would explain the strange maternal energy he'd felt from her, though it didn't explain her impossible understanding of human technology. As the morning progressed, Lily continued to improve. Her temperature stayed normal, her breathing was easy and unlabored, and she even smiled when Ethan made silly faces at her. The oxygen concentrator continued its steady rhythm, though her levels were maintaining well enough that he thought he might be able to wean her off it soon. He kept the IV in place for now, wanting to make sure she stayed hydrated, but she was taking her bottle eagerly, which was a good sign. The crisis had passed, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had happened here, something that went beyond a simple medical emergency. The bear stood up around noon, stretching her massive frame. Ethan thought she was going to leave, finally return to wherever she'd come from, but instead she began to move closer to the cabin again. She approached slowly, deliberately, stopping about 15 feet from the window. Then she did something that made Ethan's breath catch. She sat up on her haunches and raised one paw, holding it against her chest in an almost human gesture. She held the position for several seconds, looking directly at him through the window, then dropped back to all fours. Ethan found himself moving to the window, Lily secure in one arm. He placed his free hand against the glass, mirroring the gesture the bear had made. The bear chuffed softly, a sound he was beginning to recognize as her way of acknowledging him. Then she turned her head toward the forest and made a different sound, a low, rumbling call. Within moments, two smaller shapes emerged from the trees. Cubs, probably yearlings, cautiously approaching their mother. She'd had cubs nearby this entire time, had left them to keep watch over strangers in distress. The cubs were nervous, staying close to their mother, eyeing the cabin with obvious suspicion. The mother bear nuzzled them, seeming to reassure them, then led them closer to the cabin. She sat down again, this time with her cubs beside her, and they all looked through the window at Ethan and Lily. It was a family looking at a family, a moment of connection across species that defied everything Ethan knew about wildlife behavior. The cubs were fidgeting, clearly wanting to leave, but their mother remained steady, patient, teaching them something, though Ethan couldn't guess what. He talked to them through the glass, his voice soft and calm. He told them about Lily's improvement, about how their mother had somehow known about the backup generator, about how grateful he was for their presence during the longest night of his life. The cubs gradually relaxed, one of them even lying down in the snow, though they never took their eyes off the strange humans behind the glass. Lily reached out toward them, making happy gurgling sounds, and one of the cubs tilted its head in what looked like curiosity. They stayed like that for maybe 20 minutes, two families regarding each other through a pane of glass and the vast divide of species and understanding. Then the mother bear stood, huffed at her cubs, and they began to move away. But before they disappeared into the forest, she turned back one more time, looking directly at Ethan. The look lasted only a few seconds, but in it, Ethan felt he understood something fundamental. She had recognized his distress, parent to parent, and had done what she could to help. It didn't matter that it should have been impossible. It had happened. The rest of the day passed in a blur of recovery and routine. Lily continued to improve, her personality returning with her health. She laughed when Ethan played peekaboo, grabbed at her favorite toys, and by evening was trying to crawl around her play area with her usual determination. He removed the IV once he was sure she was drinking enough on her own, and by bedtime had turned off the oxygen concentrator. Her levels held steady at 98%. The antibiotics had done their job, fighting off whatever infection had taken hold. That night, Ethan stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the forest. The bears were gone, returned to their own life in the wilderness. But he knew they were out there, probably not far away. He'd study them, he decided, make them part of his research. Not in an invasive way, but observing from a distance, learning about the family that had become part of the strangest and most profound experience of his life. He wanted to understand what had happened here, though part of him suspected that understanding might be less important than simply accepting. The next morning brought clear skies and the distant sound of snowplows on the main road 5 miles away. By afternoon, the power lines were repaired and the phone service was restored. Ethan called his doctor friend in town, describing Lily's illness and recovery. The doctor wanted them to come in for a checkup as soon as the roads were clear enough, but agreed that it sounded like the crisis had passed. Ethan didn't mention the bear. How could he? Who would believe that a wild grizzly had helped him save his daughter's life? But that evening, as he was preparing Lily's dinner, he heard a familiar sound outside, the soft chuff he'd come to recognize. He looked out the window and saw her, the mother bear, standing at the edge of the clearing. She wasn't alone. Behind her were her cubs, and beside her was another adult bear, a male by the size of him. A family unit, extremely rare for grizzlies who were typically solitary except during mating season and cub rearing. They stood there for just a moment, all of them looking at the cabin, then melted back into the forest. Ethan began keeping a journal of the sightings. The bear family appeared regularly, but unpredictably. Sometimes just the mother, sometimes with one or both cubs, occasionally all of them together. They never came too close to the cabin again, maintaining a respectful distance, but they always paused to look, to check in somehow. Ethan started leaving a camera running, capturing their visits, building a record of behavior that no wildlife biologist had ever documented. Spring came slowly to the mountains, the snow melting in patches, revealing the green underneath. Lily grew stronger every day, reaching all her developmental milestones, showing no lasting effects from her winter illness. She learned to stand by, pulling herself up on the furniture, took her first wobbling steps holding on to Ethan's fingers. And always she was drawn to the window, pressing her little hands against the glass, looking for the bears. They saw the cubs grow over the months, becoming more independent, ranging farther from their mother. The male bear appeared less frequently, but when he did, he often carried prey, sharing his kills with the family in a display of cooperative behavior that challenged everything in the scientific literature about grizzly social structures. Ethan documented it all, building a body of evidence that would eventually revolutionize understanding of bear behavior and intelligence, but he was careful about how he presented his findings. He never mentioned the night of the storm, never described how the mother bear had uncovered the generator. Those details stayed in his private journal, too extraordinary to share without risking his scientific credibility. Instead, he focused on the observable behaviors, the family bonds, the apparent communication between individuals. Even that was groundbreaking enough to generate significant interest in the scientific community. One day, in late summer, Ethan was working on his research notes while Lily napped when he heard the chuffing sound. He looked up to see the mother bear closer than she'd been in months, maybe 20 feet from the cabin. She was alone, sitting in the meadow grass, watching him through the window. There was something different about her posture, something that made him set down his work and really look at her. She was thinner than she'd been, her coat less glossy. The gray in her muzzle had spread, and she moved with the careful deliberation of age. Ethan realized with a start that she was old, probably near the end of her natural lifespan. The cubs were nearly ready to disperse, to begin their own lives in the wilderness. The male was already spending more time away. The family unit that had formed around that strange winter night was naturally dissolving. She stayed there for nearly an hour, just sitting, occasionally turning her head to scan the forest, but always returning her gaze to the cabin. Ethan brought Lily to the window when she woke from her nap, and the old bear chuffed softly at the sight of the child. Lily, now walking confidently, pressed both hands against the glass and babbled excitedly. The bear rose slowly, approached just close enough to fog the window with her breath, then turned and walked into the forest. That was the last time Ethan saw her up close. He glimpsed her occasionally in the distance over the following weeks, always alone now, moving slowly through her territory. The cubs had dispersed, as nature intended. The male had moved on to new territory. But she remained, the matriarch of the forest, keeping watch even as her strength faded. Ethan found himself checking for her constantly, worrying when days passed without a sighting. The first snow of the new winter came early, catching the mountains by surprise. Ethan stood at the window with Lily, now almost 2 years old, watching the flakes fall. She pointed and said, "Bear," though there was no bear to be seen. But she was right in a way. The bears were always there, part of the fabric of their life in the wilderness, even when invisible. The connection forged that terrible night had become something permanent, a thread that connected them to the wild world around them. He never found the old mother bear's body, though he looked when she stopped appearing altogether. Perhaps she'd found a quiet place deep in the forest to rest, as old animals often did. Or perhaps she was still out there, watching from some hidden vantage point, still keeping guard over the strange human family that had become part of her world. Ethan liked to think it was the latter, especially on storm nights when the wind howled and the snow fell heavy. The following spring brought new bears to the area, including one young female with distinctive markings that reminded Ethan strongly of one of the cubs. She was cautious around the cabin at first, but gradually began to show the same curious, intelligent behavior as her mother. She would sit at the edge of the clearing sometimes, watching, learning, continuing a tradition she couldn't possibly understand, but seemed to feel nonetheless. Ethan's research papers were published to significant acclaim, opening new avenues of study into animal intelligence and social behavior. He received offers from universities and research institutions, opportunities to expand his work, to reach a wider audience. But he turned them all down. His place was here, in this cabin, with Lily, with the forest and the bears and the profound mystery of connection across species. Some things were more important than career advancement. Lily grew up with the bears as a constant presence in her life, learning to respect them, to observe without interfering, to appreciate the delicate balance between human and wild spaces. She never showed fear of them, but she understood the boundaries, the importance of distance and respect. Ethan told her the story of the night she was sick when she was old enough to understand, and she accepted it with the matter-of-fact wisdom of children who haven't yet learned what's supposed to be impossible. The young female bear had cubs of her own eventually, twins that she brought to the edge of the clearing when they were old enough. It was like looking back in time, seeing the same curious intelligence in a new generation. The cycle continued, the connection persisted, passed down through some mechanism that science couldn't quite explain, but that felt as real and solid as the mountains themselves. One evening, as Ethan was putting Lily to bed, she asked him why the bears had helped them that night. He'd thought about this question for years, turned it over in his mind countless times, and still didn't have a definitive answer. But he told her what he believed, that sometimes the boundaries between species were thinner than we thought, that compassion and recognition could transcend the divisions we assumed were absolute, that a mother's understanding of another parent's distress was perhaps universal, crossing all boundaries of species and comprehension. The truth was more complex and more simple than any explanation he could offer. It had happened. Against all logic and scientific understanding, it had happened. A wild bear had recognized human distress and had acted to help. She had understood on some level that the machine meant survival for the small human cub, and she had revealed its location in the only way she could. It should have been impossible, but impossibility meant nothing in the face of what had actually occurred. Years passed, and the story became legend in the small mountain community. Hikers and hunters reported unusual bear behavior in the area, bears that seemed to watch humans with uncommon intelligence, that showed none of the typical aggression or fear. Ethan never confirmed or denied the stories, but he knew they were observing the descendants of that remarkable family, bears that had learned something different about the relationship between human and wild. Lily grew into a young woman with a deep love for wildlife biology, following in her father's footsteps, but bringing her own perspective to the work. She had an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that seemed almost supernatural to her professors, but Ethan knew where it came from. She had been raised with the bears as teachers, had learned from that night when she was too young to remember that the connections between living things were deeper and more mysterious than most people ever realized. The cabin remained their base, even as Lily went off to college and graduate school. She always returned, drawn back to the forest and the mountains and the bears that had been part of her story from the beginning. She expanded her father's research, using new technology and methods to document behaviors that continued to challenge conventional understanding of wildlife intelligence and social structures. But some things remained private, sacred even. The full story of that winter night, the impossible knowledge the old mother bear had displayed, stayed within the family. It was written in Ethan's private journals, told in quiet moments between father and daughter, but never shared with the wider world. Some truths were too profound, too personal, to be subjected to scientific scrutiny and skepticism. The bears continued to visit, generation after generation. Each new mother brought her cubs to the edge of the clearing at least once, as if it were a ritual, a tradition passed down through some genetic or cultural memory. They never stayed long, never came too close, but they always paused to look, to acknowledge the cabin and its inhabitants. It was a greeting, a checking in, a continuation of something that had begun with an old mother bear and a desperate father on the worst night of winter. Ethan grew old in the cabin, watching Lily take over the research, seeing her publish papers that built on his work while carefully skirting around the deepest mysteries. He spent his evenings at the window, looking out at the forest, sometimes catching glimpses of bears moving through the trees. He thought often of that first mother bear, wondering if she had somehow known what she was starting, what legacy she was leaving behind. On quiet nights, when the moon was full and the forest was silver with its light, he could almost feel her presence still. Not a ghost, nothing supernatural, just the lingering impact of a life that had touched his in the most unexpected way. She had saved his daughter, had created a connection that spanned species and generations, had proven that the world was far more mysterious and wonderful than most people ever suspected. The medical equipment from that night sat in storage for years before Ethan finally donated it to a wilderness rescue organization. But he kept one piece, the oxygen mask that had been taped to Lily's tiny face, too large but life-saving nonetheless. It sat on a shelf in his study, a reminder of the night when the impossible became possible, when a wild creature showed more understanding than should have existed, when the boundaries between human and animal proved to be far more permeable than anyone imagined. Sometimes, visitors to the cabin, researchers or graduate students coming to work with Lily, would ask about the mask. Ethan would tell them it was from a medical emergency years ago, leaving out the crucial details. But occasionally, someone would look at him with knowing eyes, having heard the whispers of the story, the legend of the bear who saved a human child. To these few, Ethan would sometimes tell more, sharing pieces of the truth that still seemed too extraordinary to be real. The world wanted simple explanations, clear boundaries between human and animal intelligence, definitive lines between possible and impossible. But life in the wilderness had taught Ethan that these boundaries were human constructs, not natural laws. The bears had shown him that consciousness and compassion existed on a spectrum far broader than most people imagined, that the capacity for understanding and connection transcended species in ways that science was only beginning to glimpse. As he aged, Ethan spent more time writing, trying to capture not just the scientific observations, but the feeling of that night and the years that followed. He wrote about the terror of watching his daughter struggle to breathe, the desperation of being cut off from help, the surreal presence of the bear keeping vigil in the storm. He wrote about the moment of recognition when he saw the generator uncovered, the impossible made manifest, the shattering of his scientific worldview in the face of undeniable experience. But mostly, he wrote about connection, about the threads that bind all living things, usually invisible but sometimes, in extraordinary moments, becoming clear and undeniable. He wrote about a bear who saw a father's distress and acted on it, about cubs who learned to trust the strange humans in the cabin, about generations of bears who continued a tradition they couldn't possibly understand, but somehow honored nonetheless. Lily found the writings after Ethan passed peacefully in his sleep one winter night, the forest quiet and still outside his window. She read through them all, crying and laughing in equal measure, remembering the stories he'd told her and discovering new details he'd never shared. She thought about publishing them, making them part of the scientific record, but ultimately decided against it. Some stories were meant to be kept close, shared carefully with those who could appreciate them without needing proof or explanation. She continued the work, the research, the quiet observation of the bears that came to visit. She raised her own children in the cabin, telling them the story of their grandfather and the bear, teaching them to watch and respect and wonder at the mysteries of the wild world. And always the bears came, maintaining their side of an agreement never spoken but somehow understood, a covenant between species that had begun with one remarkable mother and continued through the generations. The legacy lived on in published papers that hinted at but never fully revealed the depth of ursine intelligence, in graduate students who left the cabin with a transformed understanding of animal consciousness, in the local community that spoke in hushed tones about the bears of the mountain who were different, special, touched by something beyond ordinary nature. But most importantly, it lived on in the quiet moments when human and bear eyes met across the clearing, acknowledging each other, remembering a night when the impossible happened and a connection was forged that would last forever. Deprived eyes. The world outside the cabin had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, every branch laden with snow that sparkled like diamonds in the sunlight. Lily slept peacefully in her crib, her breathing deep and regular, no trace of the wheeze that had terrified him just hours before. The fever had broken completely during the night, leaving her skin cool to the touch, a healthy pink replacing the frightening flush of illness. Ethan stood at the window, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hands, watching the tree line where the bear family had disappeared. He couldn't shake the feeling that what had happened here transcended normal understanding, that he had witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. The backup generator continued to hum steadily outside, the one the mother bear had somehow known about and uncovered. Ethan had checked it thoroughly in the daylight, finding clear evidence of her work in the claw marks on the shed door, the deliberate way the snow had been pushed aside, the generator pulled out just far enough to be visible from the cabin window. No amount of scientific training could explain how a wild animal had understood the connection between a human infant's distress and a piece of machinery buried under snow. Yet the evidence was undeniable. She had known somehow, and she had acted on that knowledge with deliberate purpose. As the sun climbed higher, Ethan saw movement at the forest edge. The mother bear emerged first, moving slowly through the deep snow, followed by her two cubs. They approached the cabin with what seemed like careful intention, stopping about 50 feet away. The mother sat down in the snow, her cubs flanking her, and all three turned their attention to the cabin. It was such a deliberate, almost formal arrangement that Ethan found himself straightening his shoulders, as if receiving important visitors. Lily stirred in her crib, making soft waking sounds, and he picked her up, bringing her to the window. Her eyes, still sleepy but clear and bright, focused on the bears with obvious delight. She reached out her tiny hands toward them, babbling in her baby language, and the mother bear tilted her massive head as if listening. The moment stretched between them, two families regarding each other across the divide of species and understanding. Then the mother bear did something that made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. She stood up on her hind legs, her full height impressive even at a distance, and placed one paw over her chest in a gesture so deliberately human-like that it couldn't be misinterpreted. She held the position for several seconds, looking directly at Ethan through the window, then dropped back to all fours. Before Ethan could fully process what he'd seen, she turned and led her cubs back into the forest, their duty seemingly complete. Over the following days, as the roads were slowly cleared and communication restored, Ethan found himself unable to speak about what had truly happened during the storm. When the doctor finally made it out to check on Lily, pronouncing her completely recovered from what had likely been a severe respiratory infection, Ethan mentioned only that he'd managed to keep her stable with the medical equipment he had on hand. He said nothing about the bear, about the impossible intelligence she had displayed, about the vigil she had kept through the worst night of his life. How could he? Who would believe such a story? Even he, having lived through it, found himself questioning whether exhaustion and fear had caused him to misinterpret normal animal behavior. But then the bears would return, always at unexpected moments, and remove all doubt. The mother appeared most often alone, sometimes sitting at the clearing's edge for hours, just watching the cabin. Her cubs grew bolder over time, venturing closer, playing in the snow while their mother kept watch. There was something different about their behavior compared to any bears Ethan had studied before. They showed none of the typical wariness of human habitation, but neither did they display the dangerous boldness of bears that had become habituated to human presence. Instead, they seemed to maintain a respectful curiosity, an awareness that the cabin and its inhabitants were to be observed but not disturbed. Ethan began documenting these visits with the scientific rigor of his training, taking photographs, recording behaviors, noting patterns. But he kept two sets of records. One, the official one, documented unusual but explainable bear behavior, a family group that had established territory near his cabin and showed interesting social dynamics. The other, private record, told the real story, including details he knew would never be accepted by the scientific community. In this second record, he wrote about the generator, about the mother bear's apparent understanding of human distress, about the gestures and behaviors that suggested a level of intelligence and empathy that should not exist in wild animals. As autumn approached, the bears' visits became less frequent. The cubs were growing rapidly, beginning to range farther from their mother, learning the skills they would need for independence. The mother bear seemed tired during her visits, moving with the careful deliberation of age. Ethan realized she was old for a wild bear, probably nearing the end of her reproductive years. The cubs she had raised that summer might be her last. This added a poignancy to their interactions, a sense that whatever strange connection had been forged during that storm was precious and finite. One evening, as the first snow of the new season began to fall, Ethan heard a familiar sound outside. Not the chuffing call he'd come to recognize, but something softer, almost like a sigh. He looked out to find the mother bear alone, sitting closer to the cabin than she'd been in months. She was looking not at the window, but at the spot where the backup generator had sat, now long since properly installed in the equipment shed. She stayed there for a long time, so still that the falling snow began to accumulate on her broad back. When she finally stood to leave, she looked once more at the cabin and Ethan could have sworn he saw something like satisfaction in her eyes, as if she were confirming that all was well. That was the last time he saw her that year. The cubs appeared occasionally through the winter, now nearly as large as their mother had been, but always separately, their family unit dissolved as nature intended. Ethan worried about the old mother, wondering if she had found a good den for hibernation, if she would survive another winter. He found himself checking the tree line constantly, hoping for a glimpse of her familiar form. Lily, now walking and beginning to talk, would point at the window and say, "Bear," even when none were visible, as if she too were waiting for their return. Spring came late that year, the snow lingering into April. When the bears began to emerge from hibernation, Ethan watched eagerly for the old mother, but she never appeared. Her cubs, now independent yearlings, passed through occasionally, but they were wild now, showing none of the unusual behavior their mother had displayed. Whatever connection she had felt, whatever understanding had driven her to help, seemed to have been hers alone. Ethan felt her absence like a physical loss, a grief that surprised him with its intensity. She had been a wild animal, not a pet or even a friend in any conventional sense, but she had been present for the most important night of his life, had saved his daughter through an act of impossible understanding. Then, one morning in late May, Ethan woke to find a young female bear sitting exactly where the old mother used to position herself. She was smaller, her coat a lighter brown, but there was something familiar about her posture, the way she held her head. As he watched, she performed the same gesture he'd seen the old mother make, rising on her hind legs and placing a paw over her chest. She was one of the cubs, he realized, carrying on something she couldn't possibly understand, but somehow felt compelled to continue. She stayed for only a few minutes before melting back into the forest, but her message was clear. The connection persisted, passed down through mechanisms that science couldn't explain. Through that summer and the ones that followed, the young female became a regular visitor. She never came as close as her mother had, never displayed the same extraordinary understanding, but she maintained the tradition of checking on the cabin and its inhabitants. When she had cubs of her own, she brought them to the clearing, teaching them through example that this place was special, though she couldn't have known why. Ethan documented it all, building a body of evidence about behavioral transmission in bears that would eventually contribute to new understanding of animal culture and learning. Lily grew through these years, her childhood shaped by the presence of the bears and the story of that impossible night. She showed no fear of wildlife, but had learned a deep respect for the boundaries between wild and human spaces. She would sit with Ethan at the window, watching the bears, learning to identify individuals, to read their body language, to appreciate the complex intelligence that mainstream science was only beginning to acknowledge. She understood, in the way children do, that her life had been touched by something extraordinary, that she owed her survival to a wild creature's incomprehensible compassion. The story spread slowly through the local community, whispered rather than declared, becoming something between legend and accepted fact. Other researchers began to report unusual bear behavior in the region, animals that showed remarkable problem-solving abilities, that seemed to understand human intentions in ways that defied conventional explanation. Ethan never publicly confirmed his role in these stories, but he quietly collaborated with researchers who were open to expanding their understanding of animal intelligence. His published papers were careful, scientific, never mentioning the generator or the storm, but they laid groundwork for a new appreciation of ursine cognitive abilities. Years passed, and the cabin became a site of pilgrimage for wildlife biologists interested in the unusual bears of the region. Ethan welcomed serious researchers, sharing his official observations, his documented behaviors, his photographs and videos. But the full truth remained private, shared only with Lily and written in journals he kept locked away. He had become the keeper of a secret that was too important to risk on skeptics, too profound to be reduced to scientific debate. Some truths, he had learned, were meant to be lived rather than proven. The young female bear grew old in her turn, her visits becoming less frequent, her movements showing the same careful deliberation her mother had displayed in her final years. She had raised multiple litters of cubs over the years, and the forest around the cabin was now populated with her descendants, all carrying some genetic or cultural memory of the connection to the cabin. They were wilder than their grandmother had been, showing normal bear behavior in most respects, but occasionally one would display a flash of that unusual intelligence, that apparent understanding that had saved Lily's life so many years before. Ethan aged too, his hair going gray, his movements slowing, but his mind remaining sharp, still puzzling over the mystery of that night. He had theories, of course. Perhaps the old mother bear had lost cubs to illness and recognized the signs of a dying infant. Perhaps she had observed humans using equipment before and made connections that seemed impossible but weren't. Perhaps there were forms of intelligence and communication in the natural world that humans were only beginning to discover. But no theory fully explained what had happened, the specificity of her understanding, the deliberateness of her actions. One winter evening, with snow falling softly outside, Lily, now a young woman pursuing her own career in wildlife biology, asked him if he ever regretted not publishing the full story. Ethan thought for a long moment before answering. The scientific recognition would have been significant, the contribution to understanding animal consciousness profound, but he had learned that night that some experiences were too important to submit to the harsh light of scientific scrutiny. The old bear had given them a gift that transcended academic achievement. She had proven that the connections between living beings were deeper and more mysterious than most people ever imagined. That knowledge, lived and felt rather than proven and published, had shaped both their lives in ways no academic paper ever could. The bears continued to come, generation after generation, maintaining their side of an unspoken agreement. They watched the cabin, and the cabin watched them. Two worlds touching at the edges, sharing space, and, occasionally, something more profound. Ethan knew that when he was gone, Lily would continue the observation, the documentation, the careful balance between scientific study and sacred mystery. She understood, as he did, that they were guardians of something precious, a truth about the natural world that was both too strange and too important to be carelessly shared. On his last night in the cabin, too weak to leave his bed but still alert, Ethan asked Lily to help him to the window one more time. The moon was full, casting silver light across the snow-covered clearing. And there, at the edge of the forest, sat a bear. Not the old mother, long gone, not even her daughter, but one of the newer generation, maintaining the vigil. The bear sat perfectly still, facing the cabin, and Ethan raised a trembling hand to the glass in greeting. The bear remained for a moment longer, then stood and disappeared into the forest. It was enough. The connection endured. After Ethan's passing, Lily found his private journals and read through them all, discovering details he'd never shared even with her. The depth of his certainty about what had happened that night, his absolute conviction that the bear had acted with intention and understanding, was documented in pages of careful observation and reflection. She found sketches he'd made of the mother bear, capturing something in her eyes that no photograph ever quite managed, an intelligence that transcended species. She found his attempts to explain the unexplainable, theories crossed out and rewritten, none quite capturing the truth of what had occurred. She also found a letter addressed to her, to be opened after his death. In it, Ethan wrote about the responsibility that came with their knowledge, the importance of protecting the bears and their habitat, the need to balance scientific inquiry with respect for mystery. He wrote about how that night had changed his understanding, not just of bears, but of the entire natural world, revealing connections and possibilities that most people never glimpsed. He asked her to continue the work, both the public research and the private guardianship of their secret, and he thanked her for surviving, for fighting through that terrible night, for giving him the chance to witness something miraculous. Lily kept the cabin as Ethan had left it, a research station and a home, a place where the boundary between human and wild remained permeable. She expanded the research, using new technologies to document behaviors that continued to challenge conventional understanding. She published papers that pushed the boundaries of accepted knowledge about animal intelligence, always careful to stay just within the realm of the believable. But she also maintained the private record, adding her own observations to Ethan's, documenting the continuing visits, the occasional displays of extraordinary understanding. She brought her own children to the cabin eventually, telling them the story as Ethan had told it to her, teaching them to watch and wonder and respect the mysteries of the wild world. They grew up as she had, with the bears as a constant presence, understanding from their earliest memories that the world was far more complex and interconnected than most people realized. They learned to see the intelligence in animal eyes, to recognize the possibility of communication across species, to appreciate that science had not yet discovered all the ways consciousness could manifest in the world. The bears remained, generation after generation, drawn to the cabin by something they couldn't understand but somehow remembered. Each new mother brought her cubs at least once, as if presenting them for inspection, continuing a tradition that had begun with one remarkable bear and a desperate father. The visits were documented, photographed, studied, but never fully explained. They became part of the larger mystery that surrounded the cabin, a place where the impossible had happened once and might happen again. Scientists came from around the world to study the bears of the region, drawn by reports of unusual intelligence and social behavior. Lily welcomed them, shared data, collaborated on research that expanded understanding of animal cognition. But she never told them the whole truth, never mentioned the generator or the storm, or the impossible understanding that had saved her life. That story remained within the family, a sacred trust passed down through generations, a reminder that the world held wonders that science had not yet learned to measure. The cabin stood through decades, weathering storms and seasons, a constant in a changing world. Development encroached on the wilderness around it, but the land surrounding the cabin remained protected, a preserve established through Lily's efforts and the support of conservation organizations. The bears adapted to the changing landscape, their territory shrinking, but their core habitat preserved. They continued to visit the cabin, less frequently perhaps, but with the same deliberate attention that had characterized that first mother bear. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon was full and the forest was still, Lily would stand at the same window where her father had watched for bears, where she had pressed her baby hands against the glass reaching for the impossible. She would think about that night she couldn't remember, but that had shaped everything that came after. She would think about the old mother bear, long gone but somehow still present in every descendant that paused at the clearing's edge. And she would feel the same awe her father had felt, the recognition that they had been part of something extraordinary, something that proved the world was far more wonderful and mysterious than most people ever suspected. The research continued, building on Ethan's foundation, contributing to a revolution in understanding animal consciousness and intelligence. Papers were published, conferences attended, minds changed about what animals were capable of understanding and feeling, But always, at the heart of it all, was the secret, the truth too strange to share. The night when a wild bear had saved a human child through an act of impossible understanding. It remained unspoken in the scientific literature, but lived on in the family's private knowledge, in the continuing visits of the bears, in the connection that persisted across species and generations. New technologies brought new insights, brain imaging and behavioral analysis, revealing complexities in animal cognition that earlier generations of scientists could never have imagined. The bears of the region became famous in scientific circles for their unusual intelligence, their complex social behaviors, their apparent ability to transmit cultural knowledge across generations. Documentaries were made, books written, theories proposed about what made these bears special. But none of them captured the full truth, the impossible reality of that night when the boundaries between species had dissolved in the face of desperate need and incomprehensible compassion. Lily grew old in her turn, training a new generation of researchers, passing on not just scientific knowledge but an appreciation for mystery, for the spaces beyond current understanding where the most profound truths often resided. She selected her successor carefully, choosing someone who could balance rigorous science with openness to wonder, someone who would protect the bears and their habitat while continuing to study them with respect and care. To this chosen few, she told the whole story, ensuring that the knowledge would not be lost, that someone would always remember what had really happened that night. The world changed around the cabin, technology advancing, cities expanding, wilderness shrinking. But the clearing remained, a pocket of the old world where bears still came to sit and watch, where the connection forged in desperation and maintained through generations still held. Climate change shifted the patterns of wildlife, diseases and development threatened populations, but the bears of the cabin persisted, adapted, survived. They carried in their genes or their culture something unique, a memory of connection that science couldn't fully explain but that manifested in subtle ways, in moments of unusual behavior that suggested deeper understanding than should exist. Researchers developed new theories about consciousness, about the nature of intelligence, about the possibility of communication and understanding across species. The bears of the region featured prominently in these discussions, held up as examples of what might be possible, of how much humans still had to learn about the other minds sharing the planet. But even the most revolutionary theories fell short of the truth, couldn't quite capture what had happened that night when a mother bear had recognized a father's desperation and had acted with impossible knowledge to save a child. The story passed into legend, whispered among locals, debated by scientists, dismissed by skeptics, but believed by those who had seen the bears, had looked into their eyes and recognized something that transcended normal animal behavior. It became part of the mythology of the place, a modern fairy tale that happened to be true. Children grew up hearing about the bear who saved the baby. Scientists came seeking evidence of extraordinary intelligence, and always the bears themselves continued their visits, maintaining their part of an agreement never spoken but somehow understood. In the end, the truth of that night mattered less than its effects, the ripples it sent through time and lives. It had saved Lily, had transformed Ethan's understanding of the natural world, had contributed to a revolution in how humans thought about animal consciousness. It had created a connection that persisted through generations, a bridge between worlds that usually remained separate. It had proven that the universe was far stranger and more wonderful than most people imagined, that intelligence and compassion could manifest in unexpected ways, that the boundaries between species were more fluid than science had yet learned to measure. The cabin still stands, weathered but solid, a monument to a night when the impossible happened. Researchers still come to study the bears, still document their unusual behaviors, still struggle to explain what makes them special. The current guardian of the cabin, trained by Lily before she passed, maintains both the scientific record and the secret history, continuing the work that Ethan began. And the bears still come. Less frequently now, but with the same deliberate attention, sitting at the edge of the clearing and watching the cabin where once, long ago, one of their ancestors did something that should have been impossible but wasn't. The medical equipment from that night has long since been replaced, the technology advanced beyond recognition. But in a special display case in the cabin's main room sits an old oxygen mask, too large for an infant, modified with tape and desperation. Beside it is a photograph, grainy and unclear, showing a large bear near a generator in the snow. Visitors ask about these items and they're told a partial truth. A story about a medical emergency during a storm, about the resourcefulness required to survive in the wilderness. But sometimes, when the visitor seems receptive, when they look at the bears outside with wonder rather than fear, they're told more. They're told about a night when the boundaries dissolved, when a wild creature showed impossible understanding, when a child was saved by an act of compassion that transcended species. Some believe, some don't, but the evidence continues to accumulate. Each year brings new observations, new behaviors that challenge conventional understanding. The descendants of that first mother bear display intelligence that pushes the boundaries of what science accepts, solving problems, showing empathy, demonstrating awareness that suggests consciousness far more complex than traditionally believed. The research continues, building toward a future where the full truth might finally be acceptable, where the impossible intelligence displayed that night might be recognized as just an extreme example of something that exists throughout the natural world. But for now, the secret remains mostly secret, the full truth known only to a few. It lives on in the private journals, in the family stories, in the continuing visits of the bears. It exists in that space between known and unknown, between possible and impossible, where the most profound truths often reside. The cabin stands as a testament to that night, to the connection that was forged and maintained, to the proof that the world is far more mysterious and wonderful than most people ever suspect. And always, at the edge of the clearing, the bears keep watch, honoring an agreement made without words, maintaining a connection that transcends understanding but persists nonetheless. The story has no real ending because the connection continues. New generations of bears are born, grow, learn to visit the cabin with the same patient attention their ancestors showed. New researchers come to study them, adding to the body of knowledge about animal intelligence while never quite capturing the full truth. New children grow up hearing the story, some dismissing it as fantasy, others carrying it forward as a reminder that the world holds wonders beyond current understanding. The cabin endures, the research continues, the bears persist in their visits, and somewhere in the space between human and wild, the impossible remains possible, waiting to be witnessed again by those willing to see.